Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2023 Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar virtual learning session. My name is David Holland, and I'm the Deputy Director at WestAF. I'm an African-American man with brown skin, short hair, a clean-shaven face, and I'm wearing a black sweater. Behind me is a room with various pieces of furniture and decorative objects, including a white sofa. I'm going to now turn over to my co-moderator for this session, Cynthia Chen, to introduce herself.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Chen. I'm the Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy at WestAF. I'm an East Asian woman with long, wavy black hair, wearing glasses, a green shirt, and a blurry neutral beige background. She, her pronouns, and I'm joining us from Washington, D.C., homelands of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway. And I will hand it back over to David for a little housekeeping.
Thanks, Cynthia. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat. My colleagues will put a message in the chat to give you more specific instructions. Later on in the session, for roughly the last 20 minutes or so, we'll devote that to Q&A with the panelists, which Cynthia and I will moderate. If you'd like to share something about ALICE on social media, our team will also put information in the chat about how to do that. Now for a land acknowledgement, a practice that we use to open WestAF's convenings. So with respect, WestAF would like to acknowledge that the lands we occupy today are the traditional homelands of a number of indigenous nations and peoples. We recognize that we are talking in an online space, but that the places we are physically residing in what is now the Western region and across the United States, are also the current and ancestral lands where diverse indigenous communities have lived, gathered, and healed. We recognize these indigenous nations as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. We recognize Native Indigenous peoples are an integral part of our community, resilient and responding to and healing from a legacy of violence, displacement, and migration. We also recognize the resilient nations that remain an integral part of our Western communities today. With this truth spoken, we hope to build mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference, and share our gratitude for the Native American, Indigenous, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander communities that lead, inform, partner with, and support the work of WestAF. Humbly, we commit to continue learning from our Indigenous leaders. Thank you. All right, Cynthia, I'm going to hand over to you to lead us into our session.
Great. Thank you. I'm super excited for all of you who are joining us online today to talk about federal advocacy and learn more about what's going on in our field. And with that, I would like to introduce our speakers, or hand it over to our speakers to do a short introduction. And to do that, I'll just set up a short prompt, and maybe I'll just call on each of you to have a chance to introduce yourselves. And so with that, I will say, yes, our opening prompt will be, please let us know more about the federal advocacy coalitions you're a part of and your approach to federal advocacy. So in that, think about, you can introduce yourself and talk about your work that you do. Why don't we start with Heather, so you can introduce yourself and tell us about your work.
Terrific. Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. My name is Heather Noonan. I'm the Vice President for Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras. I'm a fair-skinned woman with shoulder-length red hair. I'm wearing a black sweater, and behind me on my wall is a traditional Irish drum. And I'm really pleased to be with this group of advocates to talk about the networks of advocacy that we engage in. The League of American Orchestras is the national service organization for the 1,600 orchestras in the US. But all of our policy work takes place in partnership with the broader arts ecosystem, the broader nonprofit sector, and increasingly a wider array of creative workers who are engaged in all the policy issues that impact the arts ecosystem. So I'm really glad to be able to be here to talk about the work we do as a service organization and network with those broader constituents. The League is also a member of the Performing Arts Alliance, which is just one of those more formalized coalitions in which we are participants. And thank you. Looking forward to this.
Thanks, Heather. Why don't we pass it off to Michelle?
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Hello, everybody. Good to be here with you today. My name is Michelle Ramos. I use pronouns she, her, and ella. I am calling in today from the native indigenous lands of Bulbancha, now known as New Orleans, Louisiana. I have brown skin with salt and pepper curly hair. Behind me is my kitchen, where there is a wood ceiling and a silver fridge with some very ornate lights hanging, and no Mardi Gras stuff yet, but we are in Mardi Gras season here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. With respect to my involvement in advocacy, it is trifold. First and foremost, I'm executive director of Alternate Roots, which is an organization that supports artists across 14 Southern states. My advocacy with that organization is predominantly done at the municipal and state and local level. As Heather mentioned, I'm also a part of the Performing Arts Alliance as a member of that board and do a lot of the federal advocacy work there. And then most recently have been working in partnership with a lot of folks on this call with the recently formed Black-led Arts Advocacy Coalition. And we are in a formation stage looking at what does federal advocacy look like led by people of color. And so that is the work for me that I am the most excited about and the most excited to share about with you all today on this call. So thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Why don't we pass it off to Nejin?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nejin Lee. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the League of American Orchestras. I work with Heather. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a middle-aged Asian American woman with shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a blue top, and behind me is an orchid print made by an artist friend of mine. I'm joining you today from Vienna, Virginia, which is the land of the Manahoac. To the coalitions that Heather mentioned, I'll just add that my organization is also part of the Cultural Advocacy Group, which is an ad hoc collective of many arts and humanities and literary organizations that work together to discuss and advance federal arts and cultural policy.
Great. Claire, why don't you round us off?
Thanks, Cynthia. So happy to be here, everyone. My name is Claire Rice, she, her, hers. I am a middle-aged white lady with mostly brown curly hair, and my backdrop today is coming to you, really pretty drop ceiling, coming to you courtesy of the Orlando International Airport, which is the past, present, and future land of the Apalachee, Calusa, Timucua, and Tocobago tribes. So very happy to be with you. In terms of my relationship to federal advocacy, I run a statewide arts advocacy organization here in Illinois, but am pleased to participate in many of the coalitions that have already been mentioned. The Cultural Advocacy Group, ally in the BIPOC-led Arts Advocacy Coalition, and then honored to co-chair with David Holland and our colleague Ernesto Barderas from Utah, the Creative States Coalition, which is, and look who is joining us. Speak of the wonderful. So we're really pleased to be in that work together, which is supporting state and local level advocacy across the United States, but has the potential to be doing some federal work together as well.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, Ernesto. I'm so glad that you could join us. We're just taking a little time to introduce ourselves and then talk a little bit about our work in relation to federal advocacy and naming the coalitions. And groups that we work with, and how that works. And so far we've heard a lot. I think it's been really great to hear about some of the geographic variety, discipline-specific advocacy work, service organizations, and all of that. So thanks for joining us, Ernesto. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, I will be quick, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here. My name is Ernesto Valderas. I work for Utah Cultural Alliance. I'm the deputy director there. And as you can tell right now, I'm over in the state capitol and we're doing our Cultural Industry Advocacy Day. So I found some time to step in. But I come from the lands that were from the Paiute and in Price, Utah, more rural Utah, and I guess more federal advocacy area. I work very closely with our 6 legislators in trying to get them to tour the cultural districts that are within their represented areas, and that's typically what I do in terms of federal advocacy.
Great. Thanks so much for taking the time during a busy legislative session to join us on this call. And I'll hand it over to David to get started in some of this conversation.
All right, thanks so much, Cynthia. So we're going to kick this off and talk about one of the things that our constituents often ask us about. So we're going to talk about what some people describe as the proliferation of arts advocacy and cultural advocacy networks across the country. So I'll pose the question as we formulated it. The arts advocacy tent has widened, but some see confusion and fissures rather than unity. What is your prognosis of the current arts advocacy field? Is this proliferation of networks dissipating our power? How do we coordinate? So I know that that's quite a question, but essentially we're focusing on, we have a lot of different groups, so much energy coming into this space. How do we harness it effectively? And are we at risk of having our power and influence dissipate? Are we at risk of being in conflict with one another in all of these groups? And I will kick it off with Michelle.
Great. Thanks so much, David. And thank you for posing this question. And it's an interesting question, right? You know, the question about, you know, does the presence of all these, you know, advocacy coalitions and organizations that have kind of manifested over the course, I would say over the last couple of years, but I think it's been going on for a while now, right? I think that there's just more of a presence of it and a more visibility around it. And does that somehow dissipate, you know, our power, our voice collectively as an arts field? And, you know, I actually think the opposite is true. I think that the reason that we've seen these coalitions and this groundswell of people coming to the forefront saying enough, we want a voice, we want to be at the table, is actually empowering. I think the problem was there was no power before. I think there was a small group of folks that was representing the whole, and that group was not representing the whole. I mean, they named themselves to be representing the whole, but they simply were not. And I think what you have seen is a response to that, in that people are saying, we want to do things differently. We want to see things differently. And while I understand the framing of the question around, does that weaken our position? I think we were weak already. If we weren't speaking for the entire arts field, then we were already coming into it from a position of weakness. So my feeling is the energy and this excitement that we're seeing behind all of these new groups, all of this new bubbling up desire to see something new, to see something different, is nothing but power to me. Harnessing that power is another question, but I think that the energy that we're seeing around this, from where I sit, I think artists and creatives are more energetic about engaging in legislative issues and federal advocacy than they ever have been, because they see different people at the table, like leading these conversations and leading this work.
All right, what are your thoughts, Claire?
I mean, yes, Michelle. Yes, of course. Love everything you just offered. And just to kind of keep going, I mean, I do think I'm really hopeful about this space right now. I'm really optimistic about it. I think there's a lot of hard work ahead of us. But I think, to Michelle's point, there is a huge amount of potential. And I do think, there's some risk too, of course, when you start new things and, where you're not all aligned, and that's what heterogeneity breeds, right? Is a lack of alignment, and probably some really tough conversations and some really meaningful conversations and some disagreements and some non-polite behavior. I think we're going to get into it. And I think that's great, right? I think that's really, really important. And it's not something we've done before. And I think there's a huge potential in that for us to do that organizing work, to do that connecting work, to do that coalition building work at the national level, and to build that big tent. We're not always going to be able to keep it, right? Tent poles will fall all around us at many, many times, especially when you're centering equity and justice work. But I think, I'm a little Pollyanna in this, even with the hard work ahead. But I do believe that there are some issues that we can come together on as a field, and really build the tent we've been seeking for years and years. So, a lot of work ahead, a lot of challenge, but a lot of optimism for me.
Fabulous. I hear it. And we are, I think, all on this call collectively working through a lot of this and experiencing all the things mentioned in this moment, and certainly over the last few years. Ernesto, what do you think about the state of play in our arts and cultural advocacy field?
Sure. From a federal perspective, I definitely think that that Michelle is correct, where we started from a place of admitted weakness. We didn't necessarily have the political capital or the power that we have today. But also, I think we're also seeing some legislators and some bodies at the federal level not necessarily take us seriously, because it doesn't quite seem coordinated. There's a lot of voices shouting a lot of topics and how they intermingle with social justice, with healthcare, with everything, and how it relates to the individuals who are within the cultural industry, people who are artists, people who want to finally use their artwork, and maybe not finally, but continue using their artwork to speak out about these valuable and necessary topics and everything. And so it's hard to get legislators' attention, admittedly. But what I really think is that we have an immense amount of power waiting for us to tap into. I don't think that the amount of voices that we have dissipates our power. We just need to, as Claire and Michelle have already stated, figure out how to tap into that, how to direct it, and how to figure that out. And one thing that I would really like us to see is that some of the leaders from a lot of these national organizations that have cropped up, including Creative States Coalition, including Black, and many other voices that we've had, is to finally for us to have a hard conversation of, okay, what exactly do we want to accomplish? What exactly do we feel are we going to be most effective at advocating? Do we want to intermingle our voices? Do we want to say, this is your lane, this is our lane, this is how we cooperate? Really have those tough conversations of how can we really strategize to build that political capital, build that political power that we really need at the federal level at this time. So that's something that I would like to see.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Michelle, Claire, Ernesto. I'm going to hand over to Cynthia to take us through some other questions.
Yeah, thank you all for those contributions. I think it's really interesting to hear and name some of these groups. And I don't know if all of the people in our audience are aware of these names. So we heard Creative States Coalition, BIPOC-led Arts Advocacy Coalition, Cultural Advocacy Group, CAG. And also we have folks on this panel who work doing state level arts advocacy, like Claire and Ernesto both in their respective states. And so in listening to this conversation, I just think it's good to hear and name the different levels of work that this this field does, and that's necessary to move the work forward. But kind of from a federal perspective, I think I want to move us into a conversation about specific bills, looking at this session. And so this question is going to be more pointed towards Heather and Nejen with some of the work that you do as a national service organization. And so I wanted to ask, what are some specific bills that that you're supporting? And then do you have current bills or aspirational bills in the future that you're looking at for this Congress? And what policy areas are most important to you and your constituents?
So I can start, and I guess I would have to say first that because we are dealing with a new session of Congress, there are very few, if any, bill numbers to some of our longstanding issues of interest right now. But that said, there are perennial issues that we've been supportive of and keep a close eye on. Ones that have to do with federal arts funding for sure. And that really unites a lot of the coalition work that we're part of. We're also particularly interested in tax policies to democratize charitable giving. That particular incentive is called the Universal Charitable Deduction. And it's something that we know will be reintroduced in some form in this Congress. Also fair tax treatment for performing artists. That's of interest to us and importance. Legislation that supports creative workers and the creative economy, and policies that support international artist mobility. So that has to do with an array of things, whether it's instruments that you carry across borders, visas to engage guest artists, cultural exchange funding, and so on. Heather?
Sure. So just to put a little more context on the environment entering into the new Congress, I think we've learned several things from the pandemic's advocacy efforts that will apply in our lens at the federal level as well. So one is that the most important issue that we work on will be setting relationships with every single elected official, because we can't predict what policy opportunities or threats might be ahead of us in the course of this next year. And this was honestly true before the pandemic. We especially experienced it during our work on pandemic relief. But entering into a new Congress where the balance of power has shifted, entering into an economic environment where every single bit of federal expenditure will be scrutinized in a new way, being able to first set the relationship with elected officials as to who the arts are as a constituency, how they connect to the priorities of their communities, taking that big global approach is going to help fuel whatever legislative issues might surface in the months and 2 years ahead. The other thing I just add is that the other thing I think that became really clear during the pandemic related relief is that there is, because we're so decentralized as a country and the way policy works, there's huge interplay between federal and state policymaking, federal, state, and then local policymaking. So another opportunity for us is not just looking at Capitol Hill, but looking at the federal agencies and the next 2 years of this administration's priorities, and looking at how what unrolls from these agencies is going to be applied at the state and local level. And so this gets you to a lot of issues around embedding the arts in issues related to commerce, labor, public education. So our gaze on the Hill will somewhat be about actual legislative vehicles that might pass, but we're also looking to these federal agencies to exercise leadership. And there's an interplay between those two. So members of Congress, especially if they're on key committees of jurisdiction over federal agencies, can also apply some pressure for federal agencies to take helpful steps to support the arts.
David, did you want to add something?
Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, thanks, Heather and Nejen, for helping to frame this environment in Congress and to set our sights on a scope of engagement beyond Congress alone. There are ways to engage the administration, Congress, and federal agencies in support of arts and cultural advocacy objectives. We're going to share in the chat a link to WestF's coalition requests associated with the Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar. And I'll just briefly state, this is a virtual program as part of that overall initiative. But next week, we do have a delegation traveling to Washington, D.C. from our 13 Western states and our Pacific jurisdiction partners as well, to meet and engage with members of Congress and federal agencies in Washington, D.C. around these sets of issues. So we'll put more information about that in the chat. That will frame for you some of the early appropriations requests, the signaling about legislation that is likely to be reintroduced, because we've had meetings with congressional offices and they've confirmed their intention to reintroduce. But as Nejen said, they're not bill numbers yet, but our current information on what bills are likely to be reintroduced. So we'll put that information in the chat in just a moment so you can have a look at that and the things that WestF and our network of advocates will be centering in our engagement with Congress next week and beyond.
Thanks, David. And I think what's important to add about this this infographic that we're going to put in the chat is that it is just a selection of some legislation that relates to arts and culture. As a field, there are many pieces of legislation that are introduced, and we do try to track what's going on. And WestAF, in relation to this event that's coming up next week, made a selection of legislation that we find pertinent. And so if you have a chance to look at that, go ahead and you can take a look at specific pieces of legislation. And I think just to pick up on a thread that Heather was talking about in terms of engagement of federal agencies, and then also Ernesto was talking about earlier in the sense of kind of the interdisciplinary work of arts advocacy and kind of educating ourselves as advocates, but also legislators about how arts ties into other areas is a big part of our work. And personally, I think it's an exciting area for the field. And I wanted to know what Heather and Nejen, what are you seeing in terms of new prospects and new ways of engaging and getting gains in the 118th Congress? Is this one of them? Are there others that you're seeing?
So Nejen and I are arguing who gets to go first, something like that, or who gets to go second. I can't tell. So yeah, I would just say it kind of goes back to setting the relationship with these offices and these elected officials. So we know that it's always been a requisite that we have bipartisan support to get any measure across the finish line. And usually when we sit down with a newly elected official, it takes a while to set that relationship where they fully understand what the arts sector means in their district or state. So one of our best strategies for getting gains in any new Congress is to make sure they can see the work back home in their district and state, and if at all possible, firsthand. So I think many organizations are going about this strategy at the top of the new Congress, but Nejen has created what we call our calendar of opportunities, which tells folks when are elected officials back home. They actually usually spend more time at home than they do in Washington. And those can be really ripe opportunities for them to meet the creative workers they represent, to watch arts education learning actually happening with real people in real time. So stacking that calendar with some of the key events cultural events that are happening in the district and state can be a perfect roadmap to how you set this relationship throughout the year.
Yeah, to that, I would just add that the relationship building is, I think, difficult to measure because it will take time and it won't always show up that the support is manifesting in voting in favor of a particular piece of legislation. So sometimes that support means they're not voting in favor of a damaging piece of legislation, or maybe they will refrain from offering an amendment that would be harmful to the arts community. It's also the case that there are some members of Congress that love the arts, but philosophically, they just have a different point of view when it comes to the federal role of supporting the arts. And I know this to be true for some specific members of Congress that are actually very engaged in their local arts organization and their supporters. They go to their fundraising galas. So the key there is to look for ways to gain their support in other ways. As we like to always say, there's no lost cause. And that might mean pivoting to a different issue area. So if it's not going to be support for the cultural agency, might it be support for creative workers? Might it be tax treatment that promotes fairness for artists? So it will require a little bit of creativity, I think, on advocates' parts to think about what way to leverage that relationship, but most of all to really strengthen the awareness of how vibrant the arts are back home, so that when an arts issue comes forward, that member of Congress will sort of make the connection that, yes, I've got a number of arts organizations in my district, in my state, and that they won't see that as something that is not for them or not applicable in their district.
Great. I think, David, I'll pass it off to you to kind of talk about this next part of the conversation.
All right, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit and get back into some perhaps divergent thinking from what we just covered. So my question is, what are the opportunities afforded to us as arts and cultural advocates by not focusing on a legislative agenda or a legislative agenda alone? And I think that this builds on some of the things that Heather and Nejen have already shared as well. So here I will start with Claire.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think this is a really exciting question. And I actually don't think it's too divergent from where kind of Heather and Nejen were just landing, right? It's not always about like a thing, right? Where you walk into an office and it's about a thing. It's about relationship building with legislators outside of an office in their community. It's about relationship building, period, right? And I think I'll channel our friend and colleague Jean Cook, who says, like, we need to talk about, all the advocacy that happens outside of like passing a bit. There's so many wins and there's so many, there's so much that we can celebrate outside of passage of a piece of legislation, right? So I think some of the coalition building work that we've been talking about, the new coalitions we've been building, the new relationships we've been building across the field, excuse me, that's like, we need some of the community organizing that this field has needed to do for years and years and years. That we don't even start with a legislative agenda, right? And a lot of these coalitions we're talking about, we're starting with relationship building with one another. And maybe we'll get to a legislative agenda, and maybe we won't, and maybe we'll just kind of support one another. All these folks are involved in advocacy in some way or another, and maybe we support one another in that work. But I think, I think this idea of grassroots community organizing, yes, there's usually something you're organizing around, right? A shared interest, a shared goal. But I don't think it always has to be a legislative goal. I think there's a lot of work and exciting opportunity to be found in spaces outside of legislative spaces. And even just when I think about our own advocacy work in Illinois, we're doing advocacy to the corporate community. We're doing advocacy to maintain their presence in arts and culture. We're doing advocacy to foundation communities to maintain their investment in arts and culture. It's not, advocacy takes many shapes and forms, and it really doesn't have to be necessarily about legislative change. And then I'll also just piggyback, just because it's just really important, and we'll talk about it later, but I think another shift in the ways that we've been thinking about this work is sort of away from necessarily institutional focus and moving toward a worker-centered focus. And I think that has legislative implications. It can, but it also has, again, organizing and connectivity implications that are extremely exciting for our field. So For me, it's that relationship building, it's that community organizing, it's the connective tissue that we're building that will lead to legislative change, but that will strengthen us as a field first.
All right, Michelle, I'm going to pass over to you to offer your thoughts about this question as well.
I think Claire just summed it up perfectly. When I think about like being beholden to a legislative agenda, to me that drives timeline, right? That drives like, okay, this, we need to, be on this. There's a timeline tied to this. There's an agenda tied to this. There's some, politicking tied to this, and it takes on this structure of urgency and a structure that does not leave space for what Claire was just speaking to. And honestly, what Heather was speaking to earlier, which is this relationship building, right? And so if we're beholden to timelines and deadlines and like the congressional deadlines and all these things, then where is the space and energy and time for relationship building and to develop deeper and wider within the community? And so to Claire's point, I think that it's not an either or proposition, but I think there has to be space for all of that to exist and to coexist in a healthy ecosystem. And really quickly to, another point that I think Heather or Nejan raised earlier was this idea of intersectionality, right? If we are so focused in on quote unquote arts legislation, where's the opportunity for the intersection to talk about artists as community members, to talk as artists having living wages, to talk as artists through a, socioeconomic food desert, spectrum that is affecting them on the community front lines, that isn't necessarily tied to them being artists, but as artists who are people living in their communities, right? So if we are super hyper focused on specifically arts legislation, we might be losing opportunities and other ways that we can impact artists' lives that isn't necessarily tied to an international visa, for example.
All right, wonderful. I think that across a lot of the comments that you all have made, it is important for us to develop our relationships with elected officials, with other federal officials who may be career civil servants, with the private sector, with philanthropy. Their advocacy and its reach is not limited to a small set of stakeholders. In a dynamic and complex and challenging and frankly inequitable system like ours, there are many decision makers involved in creating our present reality and in supporting us to move in different directions that we'd like to see. So I think that that's such an important point, the intersectionality with what some would consider to be non-arts issues because they're not arts directly related or called or named as arts issues, I think is also important. Something we've spoken about a lot over the last few years, but I think we're at the beginning of the process of really thinking about how we are part of larger coalitions and for some even movements that seek to address broader conditions that could definitely be beneficial to artists and creative workers, and frankly to arts and cultural organizations and creative businesses as well. We saw a little bit of that during the pandemic with the emphasis on certain types of legislation at the federal level and at the state and local level, in which support was provided to both the nonprofit and for-profit sides of our industry, as some people call it, and where there were some provisions made for creative workers, both specifically and part of general changes in practice that allowed for resources to flow to individuals in different ways than they had historically. I think looking at all of that and thinking about how we build on that work is part of the moment that we're in. Michelle, you began to raise some of these issues and calling out the urgency that can arise from being fixed on the legislative agenda as your primary way for structuring your work, your advocacy work. So I want to broaden that a bit and talk about some of the other behaviors and dynamics that can emerge as we do this work that can be problematic especially for those of us who center equity and justice in our work. So how do scarcity, competition, and supremacy and dominance impact our approach to this work? How do those things show up in our work? Again, like Michelle, you've begun to address some of this, so I'm gonna first go to you to expand on any of the points you'd like to make about any of this. But I think it's very important for us to have some of these discussions, because I think that there are a lot of assumptions that underlie our work that are rooted in some of these issues and phenomena.
Great, thanks, David. Yes, I mean, I think, you know, we need to acknowledge as a field and, you know, as a society that, you know, our entire political system, our entire legislative system, our entire nonprofit sector is built on a white dominant culture, a white supremacy culture. And that is the framework with which we operate day in and day out on a regular basis. Now, I will take a step back from that to say not every person that is a part of that framework is working in that way, but we have to simply acknowledge it's just the way that the system works. And until we get people to recognize that and acknowledge it and understand how that is embedded and how they operate day to day, and I'm not just talking about white folks here, I'm also talking about people of color who show up with internalized racism in themselves from working in these type of environments. So until we as a field collectively can get to a point where everybody can, at the very minimum, acknowledge that, it's going to be really hard. With respect to the, you know, the competition, the scarcity piece, let's be clear, that is also driven by funders. That is completely driven by funders. And so when you take a look and peel back the layers of who's doing the advocacy and who's getting invested in to do the advocacy, the framework's right there, right? Like, follow the money. It's an old phrase, but it works, you know, in 2023. If you follow the money, you see who is getting money, who is being invested in, and who is being disinvested in. And that is 100% driven by funders in this field and in this sector, if not multiple fields and sectors. So I think just having some real honest conversations about, you know, how we exist in the day-to-day working, you know, within this framework, and what are ways, strategies, and methodologies, and frankly, building new coalitions, which is what we're trying to do, to address that, to say we're done. We're done playing in the sandbox. We no longer want to play by these rules. We want to create a new set of rules. We want to create a new way of being that better serves the entire arts community and not just the narrow sector of the arts community that has historically been the only portion of the arts community that has been served. But I'm gonna stop and let others speak because I feel like I'm taking up a lot of space right now.
Thank you, Michelle. That was great. And thank you for setting out the sets of issues for people who come into a conversation like this with different levels of awareness and understanding and their own personal experiences that they bring to bear with it as well. So thank you for reminding us about the nature of a lot of the systems, or really the system that we operate within, and legacies that still impact our work and practices, some of which we're very much aware of and some of which don't always occur to people, and how we can strive to work in different ways and disrupt those systems and some of our own behaviors as we undertake this work, especially as we seek to represent the multiplicity of perspectives, lived experiences, and realities that exist in our arts and cultural sector, and indeed in the communities that we represent as well. So I'm going to turn over to you, to Ernesto, to also speak to some of these challenges around scarcity, competition, a culture of dominance, and some of the work that we do and how that shows up and how we can operate differently.
Sure. I think just kind of seeing how we try and operate, right? Especially as I've come to learn from, admittedly, my limited tenure here at Utah Cultural Alliance already, and seeing how federal advocacy has changed as I've been able to develop my own understanding of the cultural. Sorry. with the Creative States Coalition. There seems to have always been just this mindset of this is what the cultural industry and what creative workers provides for the economy. And this is what your return on investment is. And this is pretty much the modality that we operate within our advocacy work. And it's time that we kind of step away and try and view that, yes, there are economic benefits to this industry. That's how we get our foot in the door. But then there are also very great societal benefits that allow us to learn from one another, that allow individuals to finally experience just a taste of what someone else has experienced in their own life and where they experienced it and how we can actually come together. There's the wonderful stories that can be intermingled within our advocacy work. And I think that's something that on one hand has always been there, but hasn't necessarily been in cooperation with the economic value that we always provide. So just trying to change our mindset a little bit in terms of that, I think that would go really a long way, especially as we prepare for conversations with federal legislators and their staffers, and being realistic about everything that we want to try and advocate for, and giving them a bigger picture of what it means to support the cultural industry.
Wonderful, Ernesto. And I think that that's a good segue to inviting Claire to respond to this question as well, and maybe reflect on, because I know that this issue is important to you and our work together, but our field moving away from using the economic argument as the primary or singular argument around value in a policy context in engaging with legislators. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, David knows that's one of my favorite soapboxes. I think that we haven't really got, to all the points that Michelle and Ernesto just made about the ways in which, systemic racism and injustice and equity and access have played a part in the way advocacy has developed in our field. I think that us hitching our wagon to economic impact arguments exclusively also plays, as Ernesto just said, right, it plays a huge part in, doubling down on the, we're the arts is big business, and that's why you need to support us. I'm not saying there are not valid economic impact arguments around arts and culture, not at all. It's really important, and it's real jobs and it's real work, and it's professional, and that, especially when it comes to workers, we need to be reframing the ways in which individual creative workers are perceived by legislators and other decision makers and communities. But I think there's just a much bigger story to tell. And I'll say that even with legislators, they're like, yeah, leave the economic impact study on the desk and tell me a story about an issue that you care about and that I care about, that we can have a conversation about. And so it gets really into that social and civic impact work very quickly. And there's so many stories, as I can't remember, it was either Heather or Nejin said, around, you don't start with, and imagine, you don't start necessarily with the cultural agencies, right? You start with the issue that a legislator cares about, whether it's, public safety, violence prevention, arts in the military. I think there's just so many different ways that we've used in recent years to make the argument for investment in this sector that are much more interesting, that are much more aligned with our values, in working toward equity and justice. It's just a whole new playbook that we can open up. And I would really love to see our research work follow that trend as well, right? Where we're broadening the nature of the types of data we're collecting, the types of stories the mass-produced stories that data embodies, right? That I'd like to really see those similarly follow a broader notion of what our impact is in the field.
All right, so I am going to move us through to another part of the conversation. And I may go a little bit off of our script, but I think it's important in this because, again, some of these issues have been raised as we have been having this conversation. How do we advance BIPOC leadership and federal advocacy work? And how do you feel that BIPOC leadership will transform federal arts advocacy? I also will extend this because I think in equity work, and for understandable reasons, we often center race and ethnicity, and it is vitally important to do that work. There are a range of other voices who historically have not been present in the process as well. So feel free to speak to any of that if you would like to as well. And I will first pose this question to Ernesto.
Sure. I think advancing BIPOC advocacy, I think starts with a certain level of trust. One of the greatest things that my executive director, Crystal Young, who is working her butt off right now, she trusted me enough to bring me on as an intern when I had just finished my Master of Finance and Arts Administration, but I had no experience in advocacy work, didn't really have quite an understanding of how the legislative process worked, but she saw that my work ethic, my level of communication was there, and she saw what I could achieve. And so she was able to, she gave me the position, and I was able to take the initiative to fulfill a lot of things that I didn't think, honestly, I could do, but with a little bit of mentorship from Crystal and doing my own work to understand, it was just a great experience to try and further my own understanding of the legislative process. And now I'm fortunate enough to call myself the Deputy Director of Intercultural Alliance just recently. And so it's, I think one of those things of starting from a level of trust, that same trust that can come from you when you're thinking about hiring individuals, of what exactly are the facets or the individuals that you are reaching out to and also expecting to come into your circle when you are hiring in terms of hiring practices. Maybe the willingness to engage with individuals who you may not necessarily think are cultural advocates, but they might be aligned in some other things that are very closely aligned with cultural advocacy, such as housing or healthcare or any of those other intersectional fields that we constantly are thinking of. In terms of, I apologize, the clapping is going on again. In terms of how we develop those, how BIPOC leadership will transform federal arts advocacy. I think it's, I can only speak from my personal experience, but as a raised in a Colombian household, they immigrated here. I didn't quite understand why my grandparents were so adamantly against, and now looking back on it, very racist toward Mexican Americans, especially our neighbors. And I thought, oh my goodness, what, am I supposed to not like the Mexicans who are across the street, who are doing these very little things that I don't think are necessarily bad, but it was just very eye-opening to see that racism and that sort of behavior can come from anywhere. And so for me, that experience transformed my understanding of racism and how it can be perceived, how I might have inherent bias as a Latino, and how I can better fix my understanding of that and how I can better address people. All of those experiences, they kind of come in with more diversity in our advocacy work. And I think I think we've started to see that. We've already started seeing it blossom, and that we can all learn from one another, and that there's intersectionality in all of our experiences. And that's what I think is really going to change federal advocacy, is that there's so much more intersectionality in everything that people experience in their lives and do in their lives, that it will really help us to get new perspectives on how to best advocate for the cultural industry and advocate for ourselves.
All right. Thank you so much, Ernesto, especially for sharing from your personal experiences and using those as examples that people can really relate to in terms of how we build our organizations and our teams and support people's individual leadership and development, how we can reflect, no matter our identity and whether we are BIPOC, about the implications of our own life experiences and how that colors how we perceive the world and others, and interact and engage with others in the work that we're doing. I think that those things are vitally important. And I do think as there are more and more voices included, we will have richer and richer things to reflect on in terms of how we work together and how we build community, how we build consensus, how we organize and express our power, whether that be through the political process or whether it be through engagement with other stakeholders in the work that we do. So I'm gonna ask Nejin, do you have any comments to make about this question? And then hand over to my colleague Cynthia to take us through any final questions before we open up for discussion with the audience. So Nejin, do you have any thoughts about this BIPOC leadership? How do we advance BIPOC leadership in federal advocacy work? And how will that leadership transform the nature of that work and the context of that work? And again, feel free to speak beyond race and ethnicity if that's important to you as well.
Sure. Wow, it's a great question. I didn't think I would be answering this one, but thank you for asking. I do have opinions or thoughts about it. I think one of the ways that we advance BIPOC leadership is, one of the first and easiest, most visible ways is giving more speaking opportunities to BIPOC leaders. For those of us who have been doing this work for a long time, it's exciting to see how many more people are part of the conversation and are learning and interested in plugging into federal advocacy. And the more we can sort of spread the speaking and representing opportunities, I think the better. And I think part of that is not just providing the opportunity, but making sure that everyone in the community, not just the ones who are going to do the presenting, but even the people who are sort of hanging out on the peripheral, maybe they just want to be in a posture of learning, making sure that everyone is well equipped and that we all understand why we are supporting the issues that we do, that we understand what has gone into the thinking beforehand, why we're considering new strategy. And that way, we're not just going to the same, even if we're sort of expanding the who's on the bench and going to be called up, that we're building up the people who are waiting in the wings so that they will feel in time empowered as well. I think it's really easy to fall back on the same speakers or the same, sort of go-to leaders. And sometimes there's a reason for that. There's, sort of niche expertise in a particular area, but there are also issues that a great many of us care about. And the more that we can ensure that everyone is educated from the same playbook, but also given the opportunity to add their story and their experience, it can only be for the good, right? It gives authenticity to our cause. It shows that when we say that the arts are for everyone, they really are for everyone. And I think it offers more ability to connect with different audiences too, right? Whether those are audiences on the Hill, grassroots advocates that we are, trying to get excited about issues. Claire talked about the importance of connection and storytelling, right? And I think that that's a key part of advocacy leadership too, is the stories that we tell, right? The example that Ernesto just used. If he didn't have this platform right now to tell that story, there might not have been people who sort of saw themselves in that instance, or reflecting on how we all bring biases into our work. And it's not always instinctive to recognize them. But whenever we hear someone share, even in 5-10 seconds, how that was part of their work, or how it transformed how they thought, or, they get a little bit of a reflective moment, I think that encourages everyone, whether you're an advocate or you're a legislator. So I might have gone slightly off the script there, but I think that that's all essential for advancing advocacy work, no matter what issue we're addressing, and that goes toward the overall transformation of our work. Right, we're stronger as a result of learning more about each other and learning more about the personal investment and impact of the arts in our lives.
Thank you, Nejin, for sharing. And I think we probably have time for about one more question for the panel, and then we're going to work through some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience. So thank you for your active participation. Those of you who tuned in online, we see you. And I think this conversation has been really interesting. We've covered a broad range of topics related to federal advocacy, including starting from just naming names of coalitions, but also pointing out specific legislative actions, talking about federal work in terms of engagement with agencies, getting into why it's important to think about advocacy from an equitable equitable perspective, and how that relates to the field. Oh, and I believe Claire did mention to us that she had to log off early, so we thank her for her time. So we'll move into this final question and thinking through this advocacy work, and this one will be for Ernesto, Heather, and Nejin, to kind of just connect those dots. How do you think, how do we support the connection between state and federal advocacy? We saw that this was really important during the pandemic, that state and federal connection. So I'll just leave that there. I don't know if there's anyone that wants to start. I don't know if Heather, you feel like you want to jump in, or I can call.
Sure. I'm happy to take an attempt at that. So we've been talking at the top, we put a lot of names out there of coalition efforts without kind of unpacking what they are, how they work. But I would just say, so many of them are not so formal in their construct, right? So for instance, the Cultural Advocacy Group, which now is trying to fuel some common federal advocacy asks that can roll out across advocates of all kinds. It has no letterhead, it has no dues, it has a name, but if you Google it, you won't really see much behind that, right? So I actually think that it's really important to keep being nimble in the way that we create these relationships and partnerships, and not get too burdened by structures that will kind of take us back in time to the history that Michelle articulated so well. So being able to think creatively about the ways that we connect, whether it's from federal to state to local advocacy, and also the ways that we connect beyond the arts sector to other sectors, is really important. And I'll just give a quick example, which is we tried, unfortunately in vain, in the last year to reinstate the fourth quarter of access to the employee retention tax credit, which turned out to be really important, pivotal COVID relief item. And when we went to as the arts sector to try to contribute to that effort, we found ourselves in partnership with the National Vending Machine Association. They ended up becoming a huge leader in entry into a number of Hill offices where we never would have had a relationship yet set. And if someone had told me who would be my ally in COVID relief, I wouldn't have first said, oh, it's the National Vending Machine Association, right? So I just think we have to really creatively about, are we tapped in at the state level to the nonprofit networks of advocates? Are we tapped in to the business development networks? I mean, you mentioned food security, you mentioned public safety. There are networks of people that are digging into those problems who are looking for allies. And that's a real opportunity for us to just not put barriers around who our partners are. And the other is to keep this kind of information that WESTAF is hosting. You are relentlessly communicating these opportunities, and that takes a lot of stamina. And for folks who are participating in this webinar, you're using a lot of your energy and stamina to participate and keep absorbing the information. I think we have to keep communicating really openly about these opportunities. Sometimes they bubble up ever so gradually and slowly, but sometimes they open up really rapidly. And if we don't have the communications channels available to take advantage of them, we can miss opportunities, right? So just thinking creatively about who our networks are, but also keeping open communication lines and investing our time and effort in doing that is a helpful strategy moving forward.
Thank you. Nejen or Ernesto, sorry. Oh.
If Ernesto wants to take like 30 seconds to think about how to answer this question about supporting this connection between state and federal advocacy, I'll just quickly tag on to what Heather said, which is we try to remind our member orchestras, particularly in the area of music education, but I think this applies across issues, is to show up in civic conversations that are not arts specific. So for the example of music education, it would be, show up at, school district meetings. And even when arts are not on the agenda, it's important to understand what the conversation is. And you can pick up on potential allies. If you hear that, social studies or civic education, or there are other subject areas that are having similar struggles, they might be good people to partner up with, or simply just to be showing up and be seen, and people will, if they know you're there, to identify you as a supporter. That is, I think, really important to strengthening the fabric of the community that you're part of. And it's not necessarily for, very quid pro quo reasons, but it at least opens the door for that relationship. And maybe, they'll remember that you cared about that issue, and maybe they'll come for your issue. But if for nothing else, it's just good to be there and get a sense of the lay of the land. Obviously, that does take time. So, if you can divide and conquer, if you work with the staff, that can be really helpful to do.
Sorry, I had to move downstairs because a performance is going on up there. I think first of all, I have to start off with a thank you, because Utah Cultural Alliance has greatly benefited from the investment that WESTAF has put into our organization to allow us to do much of the advocacy work that we are able to do on both a state and federal advocacy level. So I wanted to really quick say thank you for that. But also, I think that has ramifications as well to where what are the other ways that we can support and solidify industry associations and real paid advocates that are able to utilize their time in a great manner to advocating for the cultural industry. Unfortunately, political capital does not come cheap, and at least I can speak from here in Utah. Most of the time legislators will not pay attention if you are not an industry association or a lobbyist or something. And so one of the great ways is that we have an industry association. But in supporting more federal advocacy work and that connection between that, I think it's been remarkable. Again, going back to the amount of voices that we now have on a federal and national level, that we are finally learning from one another. That I cannot tell you how many times I've absorbed a nugget from North Carolina, or from Claire over in Illinois, or someone over in Washington or Oregon, something that they have done that has made tremendous success within their own advocacy work on both a federal and state level. I think finding those opportunities to cooperate with other cultural advocates that are having a different experience other than yourself, or someone who may have a much larger budget than you can definitely learn just anything you can from those, and just being willing to learn from other people. I think that is a great way that we can support that connection between state and federal advocacy.
Thank you, Ernesto,Nej, and Heather. I think those are all really great tidbits. And definitely, I think learning from each other is one of the great things in all of this work. I've learned so much by listening to all of you speak today. And I think with that, we should roll over to some Q&A. We have some questions from the audience, and I'll just read them as we saw them come in. And then maybe if there's any panelists that particularly feels like they want to speak, go ahead and just unmute yourself. And I think most of these are targeted to broadly for everyone. And so I see one from Ron Isaacson. The question is, do you find referencing the arts as an industry or as an economic asset beneficial to gaining legislative and community support? And I know we've talked about this a little bit already. Claire, I know you talked about it, but and I know Ernesto, in Utah, y'all have been pushing towards the cultural industry narrative. So I don't know, is there anything else that any of the other panelists want to add, or Claire, Ernesto?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, we still need to have, like I said, we still need to have those tools in our toolkit. And, I think that in terms of how we refer to the sector, it's really audience dependent, right? Sometimes that industry language, like I know Crystal is one of Ernesto's colleagues in Utah, it's one of her soapbox moments. It's like, we have to talk about ourselves as an industry. I want to be known as a trade association. That is very helpful in some contexts. In other contexts, it's less helpful, right? And maybe challenging in terms of some of the ways we want to reposition ourselves within the sector. So I think it's context, right? I think there's lots of different ways to talk about the work that we do, and you just need to know who you're talking to, and really, again, that relationship development, understand what they care about, understand where there's commonality in what you care about, and maybe that's economics, and maybe that's industry language, but maybe it's something else entirely. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to jump in like 2 minutes. Can I just say one other thing, Cynthia, just to address one other question, which is a little bit of a pitch. Lower down, I saw, Dustin, your comment about state orgs better channeling local and regional needs. I'll just say that some of these coalitions we're building, we welcome you to participate in the Creative States Coalition if you're actively organizing at the state and local level. Like these new coalitions, they're pay what you can, they don't have high membership fees, they get you the access to the information that you need. This is what we're trying to do, is really democratize the participation in this advocacy space. So we welcome, everyone jumping on in. These are really open spaces, and kind of very intentionally so. So come reach out to us, find out more, and see if it makes sense for you to engage in these spaces.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks for joining us. And if you need to hop off whenever you need to hop off, go ahead and do that. Great. I think we'll move into another question unless anyone has more thoughts about that argument or positioning. Okay. So another question that we got from an audience member, Emmy, Her Many Horses, says, I think a lot about the term art, working in folk and traditional arts, and how it isn't perceived as art, but more of craft or as kitschy. Is there a specific way you navigate this language to be inclusive of those who fall into folk and traditional arts? And I think this question came up when we were talking about that who is advocating and for whom are we advocating. So if anyone wants to jump in on that, tips and tricks. Michelle, I see your.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that response to that. And yes, it's, that's sort of been the part of the issue that we've, been tackling and addressing over the past couple of years is sort of like, how are we defining art, right? And what does that look like? Because I do work in the South across 14 Southern states, because so many of our artists are artists that don't even define themselves necessarily as an artist, but as culture bearers. We've got artists that are working in rural regions that, are doing very like traditional arts, folk arts. If you look at any, NEA application or any arts funding application, those categories aren't there, right? So that is part of the problem. And so that is part of the problem we're trying to solve for with these new coalitions is, in addition to when we say being responsive to all artists, also being responsive to people who may not even characterize themselves as artists because that bucket has always been made so narrow by the field, right? If you're an artist, you fit in this box, right? You're in opera, you're in theater, you're in ballet. That's what the field recognizes arts. But what we're trying to do is blow that open and say, no, arts looks very different. Arts is folks that are, doing work in rural regions. Arts are people in Houston that are doing work on nails that is about advocacy. Arts is the mural that's going up in Atlanta to, make a statement about, the NFL and Black Lives Matter, right? Like we want to blow open what arts means in the field. And so I think if you follow some of these coalitions that are starting to manifest and come about, when you see who's in the room and you see who they are speaking for, it looks very different than it has historically in most traditional art spaces.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other panelists have thoughts on this question? Ernesto, I see you're unmuting.
Sure. I think one of the ways that I've started to just personally do this is I don't necessarily, I think about a lot of times the term BIPOC, especially because when I started after getting out of school, I would put on grant applications, I would talk about BIPOC individuals, but even myself, I didn't quite understand what that really meant and the gravity of using that term to encompass everyone. And it also just kind of made it seem like a monolith of, oh, this type of person that I don't actually know or can't see, but I know that they have these issues or these struggles and these problems. It was kind of those things that I had to tackle in terms of what I was perceiving as what a BIPOC individual is. So instead, now whenever I'm talking to a legislator or someone else about a specific art form, I will do my best before I start to have that conversation to get to know the artist and know where they come from. So are they an indigenous artist from the Bears Ears tribe down in southern Utah, or are they a Black artist located in downtown Salt Lake City on our west side? So that way I can refer to them as an actual individual, as an actual person, and not as a monolith. Because when we start just constantly referring to things as folk and traditional arts, like you said, or at least the comment said, it's perceived not as art or as craft or as kitschy. But when you can relate it to an individual, this is what they're doing, this is how their art is actually, what they're talking about, what they're trying to say with it, that's when you start to get the real connection in people's minds of, oh, artwork means this, and this is an individual creating this, and I'm supporting them as an artist or as an individual.
Thank you. Anyone else, or are we feeling okay to do the next question? I'm getting nods. Okay. So we have a question from Hillary Perkins, I kind of want to target it towards Heather and Nejen just because Hillary mentioned musicians specifically, but we'll go with, this is the question: what are the broadly held myths about musicians/artists that hurt our advocacy?
I just feel like we should have a whole webinar on this question. Thank you, Hillary. How to boil it down. So what I will say, I don't think is exclusive to musicians at all, but we often encounter it in the musical world. And one is, oh gosh, just what it takes to create a career, a lifetime commitment, a livelihood around being a creative artist. I think this is the story in whatever genre. We need to tell those stories of folk and traditional artists who've committed their lifetime to sustaining and creating new arts. We need to, I think the pandemic laid bare just what a patchwork quilt it can be for artists and creative workers to have the security they need, to have, you know, the assurance that there's a future form of support for their art form. There are so many stories that this pandemic created that could be animated and beautifully told by our creative sector that we really have to capture. And we need to create a space for them to be heard. So I would love to hear, us as a sector be intentional about creating the spaces where those stories are told. Because there are painful stories, there are uplifting stories, but they're all real stories, and they've been lived well before the pandemic. So that is one piece. Just what does it take to dedicate a life to this kind of mission? The other, and this is something really specific on the policy piece, I'll go from global to more specific. On the arts education front, we are always confronting the myth that competency in the arts can't be learned and that it can't be measured, but that it's something you magically wake up as a child, knowing or not knowing, or capable of or incapable of. And so I think that, for all of those who are working and dedicating their careers to arts learning, we need to do more for them by telling the story of how much rigor is attached to arts education and arts learning, how there are national standards and there are assessment frameworks that measure as what a student can know and able to do, that they're not too magical to understand. Even though there's a lot of magic and creativity. So we have such terrific advocacy networks in arts education that are doing that work day in and day out, and whatever we can do to elevate that point. That helps us get to resolving a lot of critical structural problems around access to arts education in our public schools. So that myth is another one to disrupt.
Anyone else with advocacy myths? Okay. I know that's a really great question. I was trying to think that one through as well. And I think, I don't know, one that I think of, kind of going back to that relationship building thing, is that I think in this broadly could probably work for advocacy work in general, but sometimes I think that we forget that these legislators or people who are career civil servants are humans themselves. So, I mean, it's actually not as hard as one may think to engage in a conversation with them and do that relationship building work. Well, I mean, it's hard in its time and the investment that it takes, but I think that remembering that they're human as well, and there's a way to create that connection. And I've been thinking of that with some of the work that WSTF has been doing for our upcoming event next week, and what it means to do that relationship building work. Okay, I'm gonna go back to our audience questions. So we have another question from Graham Enduri, more or less, how can we be effective allies and advocates for BIPOC artists without crossing, well, he identifies as a white man, without crossing into white saviorhood or cultural appropriation? I don't know if folks have thoughts about this.
I actually wish Claire was still on the call, because Claire Rice is the epitome of what a good white ally looks like. So I'll just lift her up and say that. And if you have ever have an opportunity to sit down and have coffee with Claire for a little tutorial on how to be a good white ally, Claire is the person. She really does exemplify and embody what I consider to be a good white ally. That said, I think, to your point, I think, one of the best things in my experience of folks who have been solid and good allies is a willingness to step back, a willingness to make space, to Nejan's point, to allow the people around you, the people of color around you, to be heard, to not take up space. I had written down, and I didn't mention it in any, it didn't come up today, but in so much of my early days in doing this advocacy work, which has now been decades, I was always the only in the space. I was always the only person of color in the space, as recently as like a couple of years ago. And so that can be very intimidating. It can also lead to people being fearful of feeding into that pipeline, speaking to the point about how do we encourage BIPOC leadership? How do we see more leadership? Well, we have to see ourselves in these spaces. And so I think that one of the number ones you can do as a white ally is to take a step back and allow space for leaders of color to have a voice and to be seen and to be heard. And not only do that, but then do what you can leading from behind to support them and see them be successful as they step into those leadership roles.
Thank you, Michelle. Anyone else have thoughts? I think that was really well put. Okay, well, we'll leave it. We'll leave that question there. And again, +1 for Claire Rice. So sad that she had to leave. But okay, so I actually wanted to pick up on a thread that I know Claire addressed Dustin's question in the chat a little earlier, but I think it's we've got about 3 minutes, so it's probably going to be our last question, and I think it'd be a good one to wrap up on. And just thinking about, so the full question is, how can state orgs better channel local and regional needs up through the pipeline of those national advocacy groups? Oftentimes small, regional, even state orgs lack the budgets to join national committees that may require membership fees or dedicated staff person who can attend national meetings. And when I read this, I think the core of the question is really kind of talking about capacity, and just there is a desire to be engaged, but a lot of the times artists or arts organizations, they're busy being artists or busy doing the things that it takes to put on a show or do all of this. So I don't know so kind of just to reframe the thought a little bit, or question, do you all have thoughts about what can folks do in terms of limited capacity and advocacy work? And I think that's a good thought there. Like what can you take away from this? If you're an individual, or if you're doing the job of, being a stage manager or executive director of a theater company, what can they take away from this conversation?
I'd like to start off, if that's all right. I think maybe choosing your battles just a little bit, just making sure to be realistic with yourself and choose the most efficient thing that you can. If you are wanting to do a little bit more federal advocacy work, I guarantee you all of that the first step that you should do is maybe start reaching out to the staffers of your specific legislator, as they are the ones who kind of put forth a bit of the talking points for their legislators and help them to decide what are the topics and issues that they want to take up in their legislative sessions and everything, especially as they come back home and they can see it a little bit more as you're advocating for it. Just sending a quick email, making a phone call to introduce yourself, doing those things, just little touch points go a long way to, I think, what Michelle had been talking about, to really starting to of developing those little relationships, because, oh no, it was Heather. I apologize. Heather had brought up the fact that you never know when an opportunity is going to come up to advocate for something, or a new bill to bring up, or a new issue that's going to spring up out of nowhere. But having those relationships, then you can capitalize on it very quickly when you have those relationships. So just trying to do that does go a long way.
I think one very specific thing I can offer, if this is a question of an individual organization, say that they want maybe their story to be part of the broader advocacy effort, which is a slightly different ask and a strategy. But if you are a member of a service organization, so the example of a theater just now, so if you're a member of TCG, or if you're a dance organization, you're part of Dance USA, or an orchestra with the League of American Orchestras, and if you have a specific story of impact, whether it's something from COVID relief that you experienced, or future impact with, say, increased visa fees, and what would that mean for your abilities to engage international artists, tell these stories to your service organization. Find the policy person that works in a particular area, because that is so helpful in the work that we do. And we will draw on these examples in the comments that we file, in the conversations that we have with agency or Hill staff. So, it won't always be practical, but in the course of, updating your member of Congress, if you find that you're having a compelling story to share, just drop a copy of that to your service organization. And I'm just speaking on behalf of my colleagues who do this work. We really love mining those sorts of stories for use in the conversations that we have.
I just really quickly add, I think, Michelle, I think you mentioned when we think of advocacy, we think of it much more broadly than legislators or legislation, and talking to your neighbor about what you do is advocacy. So, think about every moment in your daily life when you have an opportunity to influence public perception and tell your story, right? If you do nothing else in the course of 1 week, it's if someone stops you in the grocery store and says, "How are things going?" How do you weave your creative value into that story, right? Another thing is to just remember, whoever you are in connection to the creative sector, you are the expert in your story. So feel bold and empowered. Whether you're talking to an elected official, you know more about what's going on with you than they do. You are their expert in your experience. So don't hold back, right? You don't need to be an expert in policy to be an expert in the arts and carry that story to whoever you're trying to influence.
All right. So we are 2 minutes over, but I want to leave space for Michelle if you wanted to add anything on that, or if you're feeling okay.
I think all of my colleagues here just summed it up perfectly. Yes, use your voice, be an advocate, and know that you are an expert at what you do. And don't let that intimidate you from getting involved, whether that be at the local, state, or national level. We need to hear from all of you.
Great. And I think with that, we can wrap it up. I'll pass it over to David if you have any things you want to close us out with. Thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Yep. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Hopefully this was informative for you and you have some specific takeaways and have some thoughts to ponder about how our environment is shifting. I want to thank all of our colleagues for participating in this session and for involving and including WESTF in the work that you do. It's a pleasure partnering with you in the work, and it's been a pleasure being in conversation with you this morning. So thanks, everyone. Take care.